In the Mississippi Delta, the land does not rise, it sinks. Long before railroads cut through the soil, before maps agreed on names, this region was already known for swallowing things quietly: sound, footprints, and sometimes people.
History belongs to no single nation. It belongs to us all. As we step into this forgotten world, I want to know who is walking with us. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments from which city or country are you watching this story unfold today.
In the early 1840s, there was a plantation here that rarely appeared in written travel journals, not because it was small, but because nothing about it invited visitors to stay. The road leading to it narrowed without warning. Trees leaned inward as if trying to close it off, and the air, according to those who passed nearby, felt heavier the closer one came, thick enough to slow a horse. The main house stood on slightly raised ground, white-painted but never bright. Its columns were tall, its windows narrow. From a distance, it looked orderly. From up close, it looked watchful. Behind it stretched the fields, endless rows, cotton, corn, and soil that never seemed to rest. And further back, past the quarters, past the last fence, there was a small burial ground. No marker there stood taller than a child's knee. Locals noticed the pattern long before anyone named it. On nearby plantations, children ran between cabins, they played in the dirt, they survived illnesses, they grew. Here, they did not. No one could remember seeing a child older than 7, not walking the fields, not carrying water, not standing beside a parent at dusk. Children were born here often, midwives were called regularly, cries of newborns echoed through the quarters. But something happened between birth and age 7. By the time most children elsewhere began to remember their lives, the children of this plantation were already gone. At first, people assumed sickness. Mississippi was full of it. Fevers, infections, weak lungs. Childhood death was not unusual. But this was different. Graves appeared too evenly spaced, deaths followed no seasons, and the ages, when they were recorded at all, stopped at the same number: 7. Mothers from neighboring plantations noticed it when they visited for work exchanges. They asked quiet questions. Where are the children? The answers never came directly. Overseers said they were sent away. House servants said they were taken for training. The owner himself said nothing at all. Over time, the questions stopped. People who lived nearby began to lower their voices when passing the road. Some claimed they heard crying at night, too small to be adults, too distant to locate. Others swore laughter echoed from the fields just after sunset, and then vanished completely. One elderly man later said, "Children don't stay children there." It became an unspoken rule. You didn't linger near that land, you didn't ask about the graves, and you never counted the children. Because once you noticed the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. A plantation where births were common, where childhood existed, briefly, and where no one in living memory had ever seen a child grow old enough to forget it.
The man who owned the plantation rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. In Mississippi, power did not announce itself loudly. It settled in quietly, like dust on furniture, until everyone accepted it as part of the room. The owner was born into land, not wealth that had been earned, but wealth that had been inherited, divided, and stitched back together through marriages and wills. His family name appeared in county records decades before the plantation itself did. To outsiders, he was described as disciplined, orderly, a man who believed that chaos was a moral failure. To those who lived on his land, he was something else. He kept rules that were not written anywhere, yet everyone knew them. Bells marked the day, one at dawn, one at midday, one at dusk. Children were not allowed to respond to the same signals as adults. Their schedules ran separately, like they belonged to a different household entirely. From birth, enslaved children were counted, but not named in the same ledgers as their parents. The owner believed bloodlines required supervision. He spoke often of order continuing itself, of breaking weakness before it spreads. These were phrases repeated by overseers without explanation. Children were removed from their mothers earlier than was common, sometimes before they could walk steadily. They were placed in shared quarters under supervision, away from family routines. Mothers were told it was for efficiency, for learning, for protection. Any attempt to resist was answered swiftly, not with public punishment, but with reassignment, distance, silence. The owner rarely punished adults directly. He preferred systems, structures that made disobedience feel pointless. He believed discipline worked best when it was predictable. Children, however, were treated differently. They were measured, observed, sometimes recorded with strange notes in the margins of ledgers, comments that didn't match illnesses or injuries, words like durable, unfit, and corrected. Visitors noticed the absence before they noticed the rules. No children played near the main house. No laughter crossed the yard. No small figures followed adults in the fields. When asked, the owner dismissed concerns politely. "Children are best shaped early," he once said. "Left too long, they grow crooked." He did not attend baptisms. He did not celebrate births. And no child on his land was ever recorded as having lived long enough to inherit anything, not even a name remembered by the house. The rules of the plantation were simple. Adults worked, overseers enforced, and children were prepared. Prepared for something no one was ever told. And as the years passed, the land continued to produce cotton, records, and profit. But never a child old enough to question why none of them ever grew up. The first people to notice the pattern were not neighbors. They were record keepers. In the 1840s, Mississippi plantations produced paperwork with the same regularity as crops. Births were logged, deaths were noted, baptisms were recorded by churches that might never visit the land again. On this plantation, the numbers did not behave. Midwives were called often, sometimes twice in the same week. Their entries in personal notebooks listed healthy births, full-term infants, strong cries, nothing unusual. But when those same children should have appeared again, in confirmations, in later tallies, in census margins, they did not. Parish priests noticed first. Baptisms were performed, names were given, dates were written carefully in ink. Yet no confirmations followed. In other parishes, confirmation came years later. Here, the pages remained blank. County census records listed numbers of enslaved people that suggested normal family growth. But grave markers told a different story. The burial ground behind the quarters expanded steadily, year after year. Small depressions in the earth, crude wooden markers that rotted quickly, many without names at all. What unsettled those who counted was not how many children died, but how consistently they disappeared before reaching the same age. 7. No illness behaved that way. Doctors were called at first,
plantation physicians accustomed to fevers, infections, and malnutrition. They recorded symptoms that did not settle into diagnoses: sudden weakness, disorientation, physical decline without visible cause. Some children showed signs of advanced wear, teeth loosening early, joints stiffening, fatigue far beyond their years. One doctor wrote that the children appeared older than their age and exhausted by living. He was not invited back. Another physician refused to return after being denied access to certain buildings. The owner explained the inconsistencies calmly. He blamed miscounting, poor record-keeping, transient labor. But the ledgers told a different story. Births were carefully recorded, deaths were vague, and between the two, entire lives went unaccounted for. By the mid-1840s, some priests began leaving the plantation name off their own logs. Others stopped accepting baptisms from it altogether. It was easier not to ask why children entered the books and never came back out. What remained were records that looked complete at first glance, until someone tried to follow a child past the age of 7 and found only empty lines where a life should have continued.
The children did not sleep where their parents slept. On most plantations, families shared space when they could. Children stayed close, especially at night. Here, separation began early. The children's quarters sat apart from the adult cabins, not far enough to feel like a different plantation, but far enough that sound did not carry clearly. It was a low building, longer than it was wide, fewer windows. The doors were kept shut after sunset. Inside, the air was stale. Mattresses were thin. Blankets were issued and collected on a schedule, like tools. Children rose before dawn, but they did not join the fields. Their days followed a different rhythm. They were taught silence early. Speaking without permission brought correction. Crying brought removal. No one remembers lessons being taught, only repetition, movements practiced over and over, standing still for long periods, carrying small weights until arms shook. Adults were not allowed inside the building without approval. Mothers who tried to visit were turned away. The explanation was always the same: they're being prepared. At night, children were sometimes taken from the quarters, not in groups, one at a time. No announcements were made, no schedules shared. The next morning, a bed might be empty. Some children returned days later, quieter than before. Others did not return at all. Those who came back often refused food. They avoided light. They clung to walls as if rooms felt unstable. A few tried to describe what happened. Their words never formed full explanations, just fragments. Cold, dark, counting. Overseers dismissed it as imagination. The children were told not to talk, and slowly they stopped. Long after the building fell into disuse, people noticed something strange when it was finally cleared. Toys were not found inside. No dolls, no carved figures, no keepsakes. Instead, small objects were discovered buried just outside the walls. Buttons, bits of string, tiny wooden shapes. As if the children had hidden the idea of play where it could not be taken. The quarters were not a place of rest. They were a place of waiting. Waiting for night. Waiting for footsteps. And waiting to learn which child would not be there in the morning.
When something is wrong, people look for a name. Fever, consumption, scarlet fever, yellow jack. A name gives you a way to understand it, a way to fear it properly, a way to pretend you can fight it.
On this plantation, no one could name what was happening to the children. The adults tried. They called it weak blood. They called it a curse. They called it a punishment for something they didn't understand. The owner called it necessary. The doctor called it unusual. But no one called it by a proper illness. Symptoms appeared in small stages at first. A child would wake pale. Their eyes would seem too large for their face. Their bones would appear thin, as if their body was losing weight faster than it could be replaced. They would lose energy. They would stop playing. Then, strangely, some children would appear to age. Teeth would loosen early. Hair would thin. Their skin would show signs of wear, as if the body had been forced to grow too quickly. Parents watched their children with fear, but also confusion. The children did not die in the way sickness usually kills. There was no fever that rose and fell, no visible swelling, no coughing that carried disease through the quarters. Instead, it was like the body simply gave up, as if the child had been drained from the inside out. Doctors who were called could not explain it. They wrote notes in their journals that later became unreadable, as if they themselves did not want to remember what they had seen. One physician wrote that the children looked as though they had been forced to grow in a single night. Another refused to return after witnessing a child's collapse and being told to leave the rest to God. The plantation owner insisted the children were being made stronger through discipline. He insisted they were simply not suited for the hard life of labor. Yet the pattern remained. The disease did not spread to adults. It did not affect infants. It only seemed to strike children after a certain age, after they had spent years under the owner's rule. And each time, the same result. The child's body failed. The child vanished, leaving behind a mother who did not know whether to mourn or to fear, leaving behind a plantation that continued to operate as if nothing had happened. The illness had no name, but it had a deadline. A quick reminder, if you are finding value in this documentary, please subscribe. Join the thousands of others who refuse to let history fade into the dark. The main house was the center of order. It was where the owner lived, where his family slept, where decisions were made. The house was built on a raised foundation, common in the South to keep humidity away from wood. But this house had something else beneath it. A basement. Not the simple storage space you might expect, not a cellar for food and tools. A room that seemed to exist for one purpose and one purpose only: control. The basement was not part of the daily conversation. It was not mentioned in letters or logs. It was a secret the plantation itself carried. Some people claimed they heard sounds from beneath the floorboards at night, soft, irregular tapping, like someone trying to count time. Others said they heard a low, steady hum, a sound like breath being forced through a narrow space. Children were forbidden to approach the main house after dusk, not for fear of punishment, but because they were told the house did not belong to them. And yet, it was the house that seemed to hold the answers. Years after the plantation was abandoned, when the land was sold and the main house was finally opened, a discovery was made. The basement had been sealed. Thick wooden planks nailed tightly together, a door that appeared to have been reinforced from the inside, and behind it, a space that had been altered over time. The floor was lined with chalk marks, symbols and numbers, drawn carefully like instructions. Tools were left behind, some for building, some for restraint.
straps, metal rings, chains. The smell of damp wood was still there, even after decades. And in the corner, near the wall, a narrow stairway led down into darkness. No one could explain why the owner would need such a space, or what he had used it for. Some said it was a root cellar. Others said it was a storage room for supplies. But the presence of restraints suggested something else entirely, something that could not be explained as normal. The discovery did not immediately lead to answers. It only raised more questions. Why seal it so tightly? Why leave behind the marks? And why, when the house was opened, did the basement feel as though it had been waiting for someone to return? Like the plantation itself had never stopped keeping watch.
The plantation owner did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as a man of reason, a man who believed the world could be shaped into something better if it was shaped early enough. He believed children were like clay, soft, pliable, and capable of being molded into strength. The problem was that he did not see them as children. He saw them as projects, and the plantation as his laboratory. Discipline, he believed, was a form of education, not punishment. Education. So the children were given lessons, not in reading or writing, not in trade or faith, lessons in endurance. One of the overseers later described it as hardening. Children were made to stand for hours in the sun. Their clothes were removed, their bodies exposed to heat until their skin reddened. Then, abruptly, they were forced into cold water or left in shaded areas, shivering until their teeth chattered. They were taught to hold their breath, to stay still, to stop reacting. The owner believed that if a child could withstand pain early, they would be stronger later. But strength is not built by breaking the body. It is built by protecting it. Some children were punished for small things that would have been overlooked elsewhere: speaking too loudly, asking for water, crying after being hit. Their punishments were not always physical. Sometimes they were forced to remain alone, alone in the dark, alone in a room with no windows. Sometimes they were taken into the main house for lessons. The details of these lessons were never recorded, only the results. Children would return with vacant eyes, their faces drained of expression, as if something had been removed. And soon after, they would disappear. The owner insisted it was for their own good. He claimed he was preparing them for life in the fields. But the children who survived these lessons did not become stronger. They became smaller, not in height, but in presence, as if their spirits had been narrowed until there was enough left to obey. And the pattern continued. A child would be disciplined, the child would disappear. Until the age of 7, when the owner's rules were no longer about discipline, but about control. For a long time, the plantation was full of grief. Mothers cried. They wept quietly in the corners of cabins, and they wept loudly when no one was watching. They cried for children who never reached the age of 7. They cried for the ones who were taken away. They cried for the ones who returned with empty eyes. And they cried for the ones they had never been allowed to name. At first, their grief was a kind of resistance. It was proof that they still remembered, that they still loved, that the children mattered. But the plantation did not allow grief. It did not allow the adults to show that the children had been part of their lives. and so the grief was punished. A mother who cried too loudly was told she was unfit. A mother who asked questions was accused of causing trouble. The owner would not tolerate trouble. Trouble threatened the order he had built. So the mothers learned to quiet themselves. They stopped speaking of their children as if they were real. They stopped naming them. It was not only fear that silenced them, it was exhaustion. When the same thing happened again and again, the heart begins to protect itself. When you watch your child vanish repeatedly, you learn to stop expecting them to stay. Mothers began to refuse to even say the children's names. They referred to them as the one, or the little one, or simply the child. Names were dangerous. Names made the children real, and reality was not allowed on that land. Some mothers stopped crying entirely. Their faces became calm, blank, like they had put their grief away in a locked box and thrown away the key. It was not peace. It was survival. In the years that followed, the mothers who remained were not broken by a single loss. They were broken by repetition, by the constant expectation of losing something they could not protect. And the plantation continued to operate. Cotton was harvested, orders were followed, children continued to be born, and the mothers continued to live with the knowledge that in the end, no child would remain long enough to grow up.
7 is a number people have always treated like a turning point. 7 days in a week, 7 years for a child to begin understanding the world. In many cultures, 7 marks the boundary between innocence and awareness. On this plantation, it marked something else, a deadline, a boundary, a point of no return. There are no records of 7th birthday celebrations here. No cakes, no songs, no small parties held under the shade of trees. No laughter. Because the plantation did not allow children to reach 7, not in the way other places did. Children were often taken away just before their 7th birthday, sometimes just after. It was never the same, but the result was always the same. The child vanished, and the adults pretended it was normal. The owner never explained why the number mattered. He never wrote it down, but he acted as if 7 was the moment when a child became dangerous. Dangerous to the order he believed he was protecting. Some survivors claimed that the owner believed children became unclean after 7. Others said they believed they were no longer controllable, that their minds would begin to question, that they would begin to remember. The last child to reach the age of 7 was said to have been different, stronger, braver, not in the way of fighting, but in the way of noticing. She noticed things the others didn't. She noticed the locked doors, the whispers, the way the adults flinched when her name was spoken. She began to ask questions, questions that the plantation could not allow. The owner saw it as a threat, and the threat was removed. Not with a public punishment, not with a warning, but with a quiet disappearance. The 7th birthday was never celebrated. It was feared. It was anticipated with dread, because it meant the child had survived long enough to be taken seriously, and the plantation did not tolerate seriousness in children. It only tolerated obedience, and obedience, like childhood itself, was controlled.
Most plantations faded quietly. They ran out of money. They were sold. They were abandoned after a bad season. This one did not fade. It broke. The night it happened, the plantation did not simply go dark. It went quiet in a way that made people feel as if the world had stopped listening. There were no screams recorded, no recorded cries for help, not even the sound of horses. The next morning, the fields were still. The cabins were empty. The main house stood as it always had, white, ordered, unbothered. But everyone who arrived afterward agreed on one thing. The plantation was abandoned in a hurry. Food was left out. Tools remained in place. Clothes were hanging as if someone had simply stepped away and never returned. The owner was gone. His family was gone. The overseers were gone. Even the dogs were gone. The only thing left behind was the silence. Some people claimed they saw smoke in the distance that night. Others claimed they heard a faint sound, like a child calling out, but too far away to locate. There are two versions of what happened. One says there was a fire, that the owner's house burned and the flames drove everyone away. The other says the owner simply disappeared, that he left the land with no explanation, no note, no warning. The truth is, neither version fully explains the absence. If there had been a fire, why were the children's quarters untouched? If there was no fire, why would a man who controlled everything so carefully leave without a plan? Some believed the owner was taken by the same thing he had been creating, that the system he built finally turned on him. Others believed he left because he knew the truth would be discovered, and he wanted to disappear before anyone could find out what he had done. Whatever happened that night, the plantation never returned to normal. The land was sold, the records were removed, and the story was buried in silence. But the quiet did not last forever, because the truth always finds a way to resurface, even if it takes years. When the plantation was finally inspected, it was not done by detectives. It was done by the people who had to make sense of what was left behind. Relatives, clergy, men appointed by the county. They entered the main house with caution, not because they feared the owner, but because the silence felt like a presence. The first thing they noticed was the basement. It was sealed as it had been for decades, but now the seal was broken. The door was open, and the air that came out of it was cold, too cold for a room underground. Inside, they found tools, straps, chains, chalk marks, and a narrow table that looked too small for an adult. The basement had been used for something other than storage, and the discovery raised more questions than it answered. But the real shock was not inside the house. It was outside, in the burial ground. The graves were shallow. Some had been disturbed. Some had been moved. The soil had been turned as if someone had tried to hide something. And among the disturbed earth, they found bones, child-sized remains, not all of them complete. Some bones were missing. Some had been burned. It was not a simple burial ground. It was a place that had been used for something else, something the owner did not want anyone to find. The clergy who arrived were horrified. They tried to make sense of it using the language they knew: sin, evil, punishment. But even their words felt inadequate. The county officials were reluctant to pursue the matter. The plantation was valuable land. The owner had connections. The truth was dangerous. So the investigation was limited. Records were taken, but not published. Bones were buried again, but without ceremony, and the story was left to be whispered in private. The most disturbing part was not what was found, it was what was missing. The children's names, their faces, their stories. The only thing that remained was the evidence of their absence, and the knowledge that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the truth stayed buried. After the discovery, the plantation did not become a warning. It became a secret. The kind of secret people carry in their bodies rather than their mouths. The county officials who had seen the evidence did not call for a full investigation, not because they didn't believe what they saw, but because believing it would have forced them to act, and acting would have meant admitting the truth about a system they depended on. The plantation economy was built on silence, on the assumption that the suffering of others was not something you needed to name. If the public knew what happened here, it would damage more than one family name. It would damage the entire structure. So the story was buried. Records were removed. Pages were torn out. Ledgers were altered. The plantation was sold under a new name. The land was passed through multiple owners, each one more eager to distance themselves from the past. The people who had lived there were relocated. Their stories were never recorded. Some were threatened into silence. Others simply survived by forgetting. Because in a place where power is absolute, memory becomes dangerous. Even the families in the surrounding area began to avoid the subject, not because they didn't care, but because they had been taught that speaking of it invited misfortune. They believed the land itself was cursed, that the children's spirits would not rest if the story was told. So they kept quiet, and the silence became a kind of protection, a way to survive the knowledge of what had happened. But silence is also a form of control, and the control did not end with the owner's disappearance. It continued through the people who chose not to speak, through the families who refused to remember, through the records that were rewritten. Because it is easier to live with a lie than to live with the truth.
A quick reminder, if you are finding value in this documentary, please like and subscribe. Join the thousands of others who refuse to let history fade into the dark. Today, the plantation is not a working farm. It is not a museum. It is a place people avoid. The main house no longer stands. The wood has rotted. The paint has peeled. The foundation has sunk back into the earth. The fields have grown wild. Trees have reclaimed what was once ordered and controlled. But the land still feels different. Visitors who pass by say the air changes, not in temperature, but in weight, like the atmosphere has learned to hold a secret. Some locals refuse to drive past the road at night. They say they can hear children's footsteps in the dark. Others say they feel watched, not by a person, but by something else, a presence that lingers in the soil. The burial ground remains, though it is unmarked now. The grass grows taller there. The earth is uneven, as if it is still healing from being disturbed. Some people have reported illnesses after spending time near the site. Fevers, unexplained weakness, a sense of dread that won't fade. Animals avoid certain areas too. Dogs refuse to go near the old foundation. Horses shy away from the path leading to the burial ground, and birds rarely nest in the trees that surround it. The plantation has become a place of quiet warnings, not because it is haunted in the way stories like to claim, but because it is a place where the past did not end. It is a place where the consequences of cruelty remain embedded in the land. And even now, the earth remembers what people tried to erase. This plantation was not an isolated story. It was part of a pattern that existed across the Deep South, in places that never made it into history books. Not because the events were rare,
but because they were inconvenient. Because the truth did not fit the story the region wanted to tell about itself. In the 1800s, the plantation system relied on the idea of control. Control over labor, control over bodies, control over the future. Children were often the first victims. They were seen as easier to break, easier to train, easier to erase. And in many places, children were separated from their families at a young age, not for education, not for protection, but for ownership. The same pattern appeared in other plantations. Children who disappeared, children who were sent away, children whose deaths were recorded in vague terms. Some were claimed to have run away. Some were said to have been sold, but the truth often remained hidden. And the silence was not accidental. It was intentional. The people who held power needed it. They needed the ability to do what they wanted without consequence. And the best way to ensure that was to erase the victims, to remove their names, to remove their stories, to remove their presence from the world. When history is written by those who benefit from it, the most vulnerable are often left out. And the children who were never allowed to grow up became numbers, not people, not names, just a statistic in a ledger. But the pattern goes beyond statistics. It is a pattern of how power treats innocence, how it sees children not as individuals, but as tools, as resources, as something to be shaped, controlled, and, if necessary, discarded. The plantation we've been talking about is just one example, but the true horror is that it was not unique. It was a part of a system that survived for decades because no one was allowed to speak the truth out loud.
The story of this plantation ends without a clear ending. That is what makes it feel unfinished. Because there is no final chapter where justice is served. No courtroom, no confession, no public reckoning. Just absence. And the knowledge that something happened, something the world refused to name. When we think of children in history, we often imagine them as symbols, innocence, hope, the future. But these children were not allowed to become symbols. They were not allowed to become memories. They were not allowed to grow. They were only allowed to exist long enough to be used. Then they were taken away. The most tragic part is not the violence, it is the erasure, the way their lives were treated as if they never mattered. But even in silence, they left traces. A burial ground with shallow graves, toys buried outside the quarters, a sealed basement with chalk marks, records that stop at age 7. These are not just pieces of evidence, they are reminders. Reminders that children were real here, that they laughed, that they cried, that they wanted to be held, that they had names, and that those names were taken. The plantation may be gone now. The house may be nothing more than rotting wood and cracked foundations. But the land still holds the memory of what happened. And the silence that remains is not empty. It is full of the children who never got to grow up. Their lives were cut short. Their stories were buried. But they are not gone, not entirely. Because as long as we remember them, as long as we speak their story out loud, they continue to exist, not as victims, but as people. And that is the only justice they were ever denied.
We tell these stories because we refuse to forget. If you stand with us, prove it to the algorithm. Like, comment, subscribe. Help us force the world to remember. Thank you for watching.